April 1945. Off the coast of Okinawa, the Pacific is burning. From horizon to horizon, black smoke twists upward like torn flags. The air smells of fuel, cordite, and salt. In the middle of that smoke, a battered destroyer USS Laffey still floats, though every inch of her is scarred by fire and shrapnel. Her decks are a furnace. Hoses slither across steel so hot they hiss like snakes. Men fight flames with bare hands, some half-burned themselves. The sound of another plane, a high-pitched scream through the sky, sends a wave of panic, then defiance, through the crew. The lookout yells, "Incoming!" Every gun that still works opens up. In that 80-minute span, 22 Japanese kamikazes will hurl themselves at this single ship. 7 will hit, others will miss by feet, and yet somehow the Laffey refuses to die. Later, newspapers will call her the ship that wouldn't die, but they won't tell you why she lived. They won't mention the rejected idea, a mechanic's unauthorized modification that kept the Laffey afloat when logic said she should have been blown to pieces. This isn't a story about admirals or strategies. It's about the men below deck, the welders, grease-stained mechanics, and electricians who quietly rewrote the Navy's survival manual while no one was watching. Because in the spring of 1945, when Japan unleashed its final weapon, the kamikaze, it wasn't new technology that saved the American fleet. It was improvisation under fire. And one man's idea rejected by command that would become the foundation of modern naval damage control. By the spring of 1945, Japan was dying, but it refused to surrender. Tokyo's skies were black with smoke. The Imperial Navy was shattered, its proud carriers rusting at anchor or sunk beneath the waves. Yet in the last desperate months of the war, Japanese commanders found one final weapon, men willing to die. They called it Toko Special Attack. The West would come to know it by another name, kamikaze. Each young pilot received a white silk scarf, a rising sun headband, and a final cup of sake before climbing into his plane. He wasn't flying toward victory, he was flying toward immortality, or so they were told. By April, more than 1,900 kamikaze aircraft had been launched toward Okinawa, an island that had become the staging ground for the final American invasion. The plan was simple. If Japan could sink enough ships, perhaps America would lose the will to invade the mainland. But this wasn't a normal air war. It was a storm of living missiles. For the U.S. Navy, it was a nightmare unlike anything they'd ever faced. Radar screens filled with blips, hundreds at a time, each representing a pilot who would never pull up. Gunners were shooting not to scare or wound, but to destroy before impact. The destroyers stationed on radar picket duty, small, lightly armored ships, bore the worst of it. They were the Navy's early warning line, floating far from the main fleet. That meant when the kamikazes came, they were the first targets. At dawn, their lookouts would scan the eastern sky and see faint dots low on the horizon. Sometimes the Japanese came alone, sometimes in packs of 20 or 30, but always they came to die. Every man aboard knew what that meant. There were no rules anymore, no mercy. One sailor on picket duty later said, "They weren't pilots anymore, they were falling stars. You didn't shoot to stop them. You shot to stay alive for another 30 seconds." By the time the Battle of Okinawa ended, the United States Navy had lost nearly 50 ships, and more than 4,900 sailors were dead, most of them burned, drowned, or trapped below deck. The brass in Washington called it acceptable losses. But to the men on deck, those figures weren't statistics, they were shipmates. And among them, aboard a single destroyer named the USS Laffey, a quiet group of mechanics had already decided they wouldn't wait for orders to save themselves. They were about to break Navy rules, and in doing so, make history. Her name was USS Laffey DD 724, a Sumner-class destroyer, sleek, fast and lethal. Commissioned in 1944, she'd already earned her place in the war's most dangerous waters: Normandy, Cherbourg, the Philippines. But nothing in her short life compared to what was waiting off Okinawa. Her captain, Commander Frederick Becton, was a Southerner, calm, steady, not one for speeches. His men called him Fearless Freddy, not because he lacked fear, but because he never showed it. To him, leadership meant something simple: you fight until the ship dies, or you do. By April 16, 1945, the Laffey was stationed on radar picket duty north of Okinawa, a suicide post even before the kamikazes arrived. These picket ships were small targets in a vast ocean, surrounded by radar screens and AA guns, the first to see the enemy and the last to get help. At dawn, the lookouts spotted the first wave. Within minutes, the sky turned into a swarm of dots: fighters, dive bombers, and then the unmistakable shape of kamikazes. The Laffey's gunners opened fire. 5-inch shells tore the sky apart. 40 cannons hammered until the barrels smoked red, but there were too many. At 8:30 a.m., the first kamikaze dove straight into the aft gun mount. A sheet of flame erupted. Seconds later, another crashed near the bridge, spraying fuel and shrapnel across the deck. Then came a bomb hit, then another. The deck buckled, power flickered. In less than 15 minutes, Laffey had been hit or near missed by over half a dozen aircraft, and more were coming. Commander Becton refused to give the order to abandon ship. He walked the bridge, bleeding from glass shards, shouting above the roar, "We're staying alive! We'll fight as long as a single gun fires." That line would become legend, but what saved his ship that day wasn't only courage. It was preparation. It was the men below deck who had refused to wait for permission. Weeks earlier, Laffey's engineering team, machinists, mates, welders, electricians, had taken a dangerous liberty. They'd reinforced the steel bulkheads around the ammunition trunks. They'd added a backup fire main, spliced into the primary waterline, so that even if one section was shattered, they could still pump seawater through another. They'd even pre-rigged a foam system, built from spare parts and chemical tanks scavenged from a damaged carrier. It was messy, unofficial, and completely outside Navy regulations. But when the ship started burning, when flames crawled toward the magazines, that unauthorized system worked. One sailor later said, "We didn't wait for orders, we just opened the valves. And damned if that foam didn't smother the fire before it hit the ammo." That's when the truth began to surface. The difference between a ship that sinks in 3 minutes and one that survives 22 attacks isn't luck. It's ingenuity. What the admirals dismissed as unnecessary, a mechanic's backup plan, was now the only thing standing between life and total annihilation. And the man who had first proposed it? He wasn't an officer. He wasn't even on the bridge. He was a chief machinist's mate, down in the belly of the ship, surrounded by oil and steam, a man whose ideas had once been rejected outright. But soon, those same ideas would rewrite the rules of naval survival. Long before Okinawa, before the sky turned into a swarm of burning aircraft, one man had already seen the writing on the wall. His name has been lost in official records, maybe deliberately, maybe by accident. Some say it was Chief Machinist's mate Harold "Red" Lawson. Others insist it was a sailor from the Hadley or the Evans. The truth is, he stood for hundreds of men like him, quiet engineers, buried in the noise and heat of the ship's heart. They were the ones who knew that when a ship was hit, the bridge didn't save you. The engine room did. Lawson had survived a torpedo strike off Leyte Gulf months earlier. He'd watched as fire spread through the compartments faster than men could move. The pumps lost pressure, foam lines failed, and within minutes the forward magazine ignited. That ship went down in under 10 minutes. After that, Lawson started sketching. On a scrap of blueprint paper, using grease-stained hands, he designed a redundant firefighting system, a second set of pipes and valves that could bypass damaged sections if the main fire main was destroyed. He added manual hand pumps, portable bypass couplings, and steel reinforcements for the ammo trunk bulkheads. It wasn't elegant, but it made sense. It was simple. It was survival. When he submitted the proposal to command, the answer came fast and cold. Rejected. Unnecessary. Non-standard modification adds weight and violates engineering protocol. Lawson didn't argue. He just went back to work and waited. But Becton's Laffey wasn't run by the kind of men who always followed the book. Below deck, where the heat and the smell of oil clung to your skin, the crew started building anyway. At night, when official inspections were done, they worked by the light of flashlights and welding arcs. They scavenged old fittings from damaged ships, raided spare parts lockers, and welded in secret. They installed a manual bypass valve behind the main seawater pump, a pressure relief that could reroute flow if the primary pipe was shattered. They built a crude but functional foam injector using aviation fuel hoses and a damaged chemical tank. And they strengthened the ammunition handling rooms with scrap armor plates salvaged from a wrecked landing craft. It wasn't in the manual, it wasn't authorized, but it worked. When a junior officer stumbled on what they were doing, he threatened to report it. Lawson simply wiped his hands on a rag and said, "Sir, if that line ever breaks and you're standing up there, you'll thank me." The officer didn't file the report. The work continued. No one on the Laffey could have known that those quiet nights of defiance would decide the fate of the entire ship. Because when the kamikazes finally came and the deck turned into hell itself, the difference between unauthorized plumbing and official Navy design wouldn't matter. Only one thing would, whether the water still flowed when the flames reached the magazines. Morning, April 16th, 1945, Okinawa's northern picket line. Dawn breaks under a pale haze the kind sailors learn to fear. It means good visibility for the enemy. At 8:25 a.m., radar picks up incoming bogies. Becton's men tense. Gunners load belts, loaders slap helmets, and damage control crews take positions they already know too well. Within minutes, dozens of Japanese aircraft are bearing down. Zeros, Vals, Judis. It's not a single raid, it's a wave. Then it starts. The first kamikaze dives out of the sun, strafing the deck before slamming into the aft gun mount. A tower of flame erupts. Men are thrown into the air like rag dolls. The after 20mm mount disappears in a bloom of smoke and fire. A second one follows, diving so low the pilot's face is visible before impact. The plane explodes near the starboard side, tearing a hole big enough to drive a truck through. The concussion knocks sailors off their feet. Steam pipes burst. The fire main shudders. On the bridge, Becton steadies himself, one hand bleeding, shouting over the din, "Keep firing! Don't let a single one through!" The guns answer, roaring, defiant, unstoppable. But below deck, chaos rules. The main fire main, the ship's lifeline, is ruptured. Water pressure collapses. Flames begin spreading toward the aft magazine. In the noise and smoke, Chief Lawson's voice cuts through, "Switch to the backup. Now." No one hesitates. The crew scrambles to open the hidden valve, the one that isn't supposed to exist. The unauthorized bypass line begins to hum. Within seconds, seawater rushes through alternate pipes, gurgling like blood through new veins. The foam rig activates next crude, improvised but alive. Milky white chemical foam floods compartments that should have been sealed tombs. One sailor later recalled, "We didn't even know it was rigged to work like that. One second we had nothing, next second the whole deck was drowning in foam. We thought it was a miracle." It wasn't. It was Lawson's blueprint. Above deck, another kamikaze hits, then another. A plane crashes into the mainmast, another into the fantail. In 80 minutes, the Laffey has hit 22 times, 7 direct impacts, the rest glancing or near misses. But through it all, the pumps never stop. Foam keeps coming, water keeps flowing. Every section that should have exploded stays contained, the ammunition magazines stay cool, and somehow, impossibly, the ship stays afloat. By 10 a.m., the attack is over. The ocean around Laffey is littered with burning aircraft and oil slicks. Her decks are blackened, her guns mangled, her crew exhausted. 92 men are dead or wounded. But the ship herself still breathes. As smoke clears, Becton stares out from the bridge, eyes red from smoke and grief, and mutters the line that will define his legend. "I'll never abandon ship as long as a single gun will fire." What he doesn't say, what the official reports never mention, is that he only had that choice because a machinist's illegal modification kept the Laffey alive. For the rest of the war, that secret stayed below deck, whispered only among the engineers who knew what really happened. But the Laffey wasn't the only ship to face that storm. And soon, another destroyer, the USS Hadley, would test the same kind of improvisation against an even greater swarm. May 11, 1945, just 3 weeks after the Laffey's inferno. On the northern radar line, 2 destroyers, USS Hadley DD 774 and USS Evans DD 552, are on picket duty. They're out there alone, separated by miles of open water, watching the skies for what everyone now calls kikusui, floating chrysanthemum attacks. Japan's last suicide waves. It's early morning. The sea is calm, the sky deceptively blue. Hadley's crew knows what that means. The enemy will come from the Sunday at 7 a.m. Radar lights up dozens of bogies, then hundreds. Within minutes, the 2 ships are facing more than 150 enemy aircraft. The first wave dives in. Gunners open up 5-inch, 40mm, 20mm. The air turns into a blizzard of tracer fire. The ocean shudders from near misses. In the chaos, Hadley's gunners achieve the impossible. 23 confirmed kills, the highest single-ship tally of the entire war. 1 Japanese plane every 90 seconds. But heroism has a price. 3 kamikazes break through. One slams into the aft deck, ripping open the hull. Another crashes amidships, detonating fuel and ordnance. The third explodes near the forward gun mount, shattering the deck into jagged fragments. Hadley loses power. The ship lists hard to port. Flames engulf the superstructure. Men are burned, choking, blinded. Down below, it's chaos again. Heat, smoke, flooding. The main fire main is ruptured. Electric pumps fail. And then, like on the Laffey, someone remembers the bypass system. Hadley's engineering team, led by a young lieutenant who had served temporary duty on the Laffey, had installed their own version of the Lawson rig. It wasn't official. It wasn't even in the logs, but it worked. They open the valves, and seawater begins coursing through alternate lines. They switch to hand-driven pumps, sweating in 130-degree heat, choking on smoke, refusing to stop. When the flames reach the aft magazine, they use a modified CO2 flooding system scavenged from aircraft hangars, another off-the-record hack, to smother the fire. One sailor later said, "We didn't think about dying. We just kept turning valves until the ship stopped screaming. By mid-morning, the attack is over. The sea around Hadley is on fire. Evans, nearby, is burning too. Hadley's decks are shredded, her bridge is gone, and yet she floats. Barely, but she floats. Her crew saves 168 wounded men, keeps the ship from exploding, and later tows her all the way back to Okinawa. For those who saw it, the conclusion was clear. This wasn't luck, it was adaptation. Across the Pacific, rumors began to spread through the fleet. Laffey's trick saved another ship. Hadley used the same foam system. Some mechanic came up with it before the brass even knew. Word reached the Bureau of Ships. Inspectors were ordered to study both vessels, how two destroyers, hit harder than almost any others, had somehow refused to sink. What they found would embarrass the bureaucracy and change naval engineering forever. When the smoke of Okinawa finally cleared, the United States Navy did something it rarely did during wartime. It paused to ask why some ships had lived while others had died. The reports were sobering. Of the 41 radar picket ships deployed around Okinawa, nearly half were sunk or crippled. The kamikazes had inflicted more losses in 2 months than entire Pacific campaigns had before. But among the wreckage stood two names that refused to be forgotten: Laffey and Hadley. Both had faced impossible odds, both had been gutted by suicide planes, and both had survived. Investigators from the Bureau of Ships and Damage Control Command boarded the Laffey in the weeks following the battle. What they found puzzled them. The bulkheads had held far beyond design limits. The fire mains had somehow kept pressure even with multiple hull ruptures. There were pipes that weren't on any blueprint, valves no one could account for, foam lines spliced into fuel transfer systems. It was as if the ship had evolved mid-war. When engineers questioned the crew, one machinist shrugged and said, "Sir, we just made what we needed." The investigators wrote it down quietly. They didn't reprimand anyone. They couldn't. The evidence spoke for itself. Officially, the modifications were classified as field adaptations. Unofficially, everyone knew what they were: rule-breaking ingenuity that had saved hundreds of lives. Within months, the Bureau issued a new circular. Recommendation: secondary fire main installation, auxiliary foam injection points, local compartmentalization reinforcements. It was, word for word, Lawson's original blueprint, the one stamped "rejected" a year earlier. Admiral Richmond Turner, reviewing the Okinawa reports, wrote privately, "Our greatest weapon was not machinery, but the inventiveness of our men. No directive could have ordered this. It came from initiative." Commander Becton testified before a Navy board and later Congress. His statement was measured, but one line stood out: "My ship lived because my crew refused to wait for orders." He never mentioned names, never said who built what or when. But in the tight community of engineers and machinists, they all knew. The story of the rejected mechanics idea spread through every destroyer and repair yard in the Pacific. Soon, similar modifications appeared everywhere, from the Essex-class carriers to the smallest LSTs. Foam rigs, bypass pumps, steel trunking, all became standard procedure. It wasn't glamorous work. There were no medals, no parades. But for every sailor who crawled through smoke and fire to turn a valve or seal a hatch, it was a quiet victory, the kind that meant going home. For once, the Navy bureaucracy listened, not to admirals, but to mechanics. And from that moment forward, the doctrine of damage control would never be the same again. When the war ended in August 1945, Japan lay in ruins. But within the American Navy, something far more enduring had been built, a new faith in human ingenuity. The Bureau of Ships didn't issue medals for welders or machinists. They didn't name destroyers after mechanics. But their fingerprints began showing up everywhere. By the late 1940s, every new destroyer and carrier design included what were now called redundant survivability systems, backup fire mains, independent power circuits, localized foam and CO2 systems for every deck. These weren't abstract innovations, they were Laffey's scars turned into blueprints. The Laffey's own repairs became a test case. Engineers at Mare Island Naval Shipyard studied her burned hull like a laboratory specimen. They found something astonishing. Despite 7 direct hits, the ship's compartmental integrity was never fully breached because of those illegal reinforcements welded from scrap plate. That finding led to a major redesign of future destroyer classes. Bulkheads were thickened, compartment doors improved, and every new vessel carried emergency hand pumps, simple, manual systems that could move water even when power failed. What began as one man's rejected sketch had become a pillar of naval engineering. In 1950, as the Cold War dawned, the Navy began preparing for a new kind of threat: missile strikes and nuclear shockwaves. Engineers realized the same principles that saved the Laffey from kamikazes would also protect ships from missile-induced fires. They called it compartmentalized damage resilience. The logic was pure, Lawson. Assume the worst, plan for chaos, and trust the man who can turn a wrench when everything else fails. Even modern Aegis-class destroyers trace parts of their design philosophy back to that Okinawa battle, the insistence that no single system should be allowed to fail completely. Decades later, when naval officers toured the preserved USS Laffey in Charleston, many noticed something odd. There, deep in her belly, still welded to a pipe, was an old hand valve not on any official diagram. A tour guide once told a visitor, "We think it's one of Lawson's. It's just a piece of metal, but for those who know the story, it's a monument to the nameless sailors who refused to die by the book." Because in every generation of warfare, technology changes, but survival never does. It still depends on courage, teamwork, and a refusal to accept impossible. And that lesson, born in fire and steel off Okinawa, became the Navy's unspoken creed. We build systems, but men save ships. In every war, there are names etched in stone: admirals, aces, generals. But some heroes leave no name, no medal, no photograph, only a set of blueprints stained with oil and blood. Somewhere in a steel belly off Okinawa, in the roar of pumps and the crack of flames, an ordinary mechanic broke the rules and saved a fleet. He wasn't chasing glory. He wasn't following orders. He was following instinct, that small, stubborn voice. Every veteran knows the one that says, "If no one fixes it, we all die." That voice built a backup pipe where none was allowed. That voice welded armor in secret. That voice turned fear into invention. And because of it, the USS Laffey fought off 22 kamikazes in 80 minutes. Because of it, the USS Hadley survived when 3 planes hit her at once. Because of it, the US Navy rewrote its doctrine, reshaping every warship for the next 70 years. The mechanic's name may be gone, but his fingerprints are. Everywhere, in every fire line, every emergency valve, every damage control drill whispered to new recruits. Commander Frederick Becton was once asked how his ship endured when so many others sank. He paused for a moment and said, "My crew believed in preparation. We believed in each other. That's what war teaches best, that survival doesn't always come from orders or hierarchy, but from the courage to think differently when everything is falling apart." When the museum lights flicker across the old Laffey today, you can still hear the hum of her pumps, smell the faint ghost of oil and salt. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the voice of that mechanic saying, "Don't wait for permission, just fix it." Because in the end, the story of how one rejected idea saved America's fleet isn't just a footnote in history, it's a reminder of what keeps every generation alive: courage, ingenuity, and the will to stand between chaos and survival. Fade out, distant ocean, the creak of a ship's hull, and a final, slow line delivered with reverence. Ships may die, but their ideas live forever.